This video is brought to you by PrizePicks. Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to QnA, the show where I take your questions and answer them here in video format. Ton of questions to get into, so we're just going to jump to it. First question comes from Pangas7, who says, I really like how Jerry Jeudy and Casey Concepcion complement each other. Both guys can line up in different spots effectively out the slot, while having Denzel Boston at the Y or really the Z could create some serious matchup problems for defenses. All of a sudden, the wide receiver room feels much more complete and significantly upgraded since last season. What do you think? This is my point here, too. I think I talked about this last year during the season with Daniel Fuise, where we were talking about the Browns wide receiver room. And one of the things that kind of came up was that just the injury of Cedric Tillman made people in the Browns wide receiver room have to play positions within that wide receiver room that they're not good at. And it kind of threw off the whole feng shui of the room, right? Now you're much more resilient, right? You can withstand a injury to a player and not have the whole thing be thrown off whack because you have more viable bodies to throw out there. But also Casey Concepcion, Denzel Boston, and Jerry Jeudy, they all kind of put each other into the right place to where they could be their most effective self, right? Jerry Jeudy's going to be your number one. Casey Concepcion's going to be somebody that you're going to draw up a lot of stuff to get the ball in his hands quickly with. And then Denzel Boston is going to be the guy that can win at the mid to intermediate level and especially in the red zone. So you have guys who can kind of fill out your passing game and create the kind of depth that you need if they're able to be successful at this level. So, yeah, I do think it fits really well. And I think it solves a big problem that they had last year, which is when things went wrong, when guys got hurt, they could not put guys into the right position because they just simply did not have the personnel to do so. So huge fix there from Cleveland by adding those two bodies, or those two guys in the draft, right? Ken Adams says this. Q, how do you feel about bringing in a veteran running back? I'm not comfortable with Rocket Sanders or Sampson carrying the load if Quinshawn isn't ready to start the season. Thanks for everything you do. Now, my understanding is that Quinshawn will be back for camp and subsequently back for the season. But if he can't be ready for the start of the season, I've been advocating for this for a while. Why not bring Nick Chubb back? You know, I think the fans would like it. I think he's an effective enough running back to be able to carry the load and make sure that Dylan Sampson isn't being put out of position. And I think, you know, having a guy in that room who's a veteran, who cares about the Cleveland Browns, who cares about being a Brown, can set the right example for that room. So, yeah, I would love it if they brought back Nick Chubb for a role like that. And I think Nick Chubb would be perfect for a role like that. We're going to continue with these questions, but first I got to thank my sponsor, PrizePicks. Hey, let me talk to you about my sponsor for this year, PrizePicks. It's a fun way to win cash while you're watching your favorite teams. Forget complex betting rules. Their app is designed to be incredibly easy to use. Just pick more or less on a few player stats and lock in your lineup. Speaking of, here are my picks for this upcoming NFL season. They have Myles Garrett at 14 sacks here. I think he will get more than 14 sacks. Joe Burrow at 3,875 passing yards. I think he'll be a 4,000-yard passer. I'm going to go with more. They have Derrick Henry at 1,224 yards. I'm going to go less than that. Check to see if PrizePicks is available in your state. You can follow me on the app at KWEN_C to see all of my lineups. Download the PrizePicks app today. Play $5 and get $50 in lineups when you download the app using the link in the description. All right, this is from Travis. Travis says this. Do you see the potential in Taylen Green? He played for Petrino, who also coached Vic and Lamar, similar athletic traits. I'll trade and waive Dylan to quietly develop Taylen, who seems to have some strong work ethic and a desire to succeed. So here's what I'll say about Taylen Green. I did a film breakdown of him that's going to release Monday morning. The talent is certainly there from a physical standpoint. I do have concerns about his ability to just see the field, because there are times where there are options available to him that he should absolutely be seeing, and he just doesn't see them, right? I don't think you're going to have success putting Taylen Green in a traditional offense. I think what you're going to have to do with Taylen Green is put him in a very modified offense, right? Almost a gimmick style offense. Something like what Greg Roman was doing with Lamar early, but like it's permanent, right? What Greg Roman did with Colin Kaepernick. Maybe Greg Roman's the perfect person to have with Taylen Green. And I know there is some Greg Roman influence in this Browns offense because they brought in one of the former run game coordinators that helped bring Greg Roman's run game to Baltimore after Greg Roman had left. So it would have to be something like that for him to be successful. He doesn't have access to a ton of like layered throws. So I don't think he's somebody you're ever going to have throw the whole tree. This is somebody you want to put in RPO situations, quick decisions, quick reads, simple reads, and then a lot of running. I think if you do that, there could be something there with Taylen Green, right? But he also needs to do a lot of work before we can even access any of that. He has horrific feet at times, especially when he's really trying to put his like most into a football. He does some of the weirdest shit I've ever seen. And for a guy as big as he is, he struggles to play like a big quarterback. Sometimes you watch him, and if it weren't for him being giant, you would think that he's 6 foot, 200 pounds the way that he plays the position. So certainly a lot of work to be done there with Taylen Green. Is there potential? I think so. There's some potential there. But I don't want to underestimate the work that would have to be done to access any of it, both on Taylen Green's side and on the Cleveland Browns side. And I do wonder if it's going to be something that they see as worthwhile, right? So that's the big question here. And also time, right? Like, is the time going to match up? Because he's going to take a while. Like, that's a long-term project. Michael says this: if you could design a feeder competition for the NFL, like the NFL Europe, how would you structure it? And where would it be? And how would it take place? Any other specific rules that you would add for those players who need just more snaps outside the NFL? This is a difficult one, because we've seen leagues come across. And I think the problem with developmental leagues, and we got to look at this wide, right? The only developmental system that seems to have worked is the MLB's developmental system. I don't follow hockey enough to know if that system works. I don't follow soccer enough to know if their feeder systems work. You guys can give me the data there and convince me. But the only one that I'm aware of that actually works is the MLB system, right? And I think that a lot of the reasons that works is very unique to that sport. It's a sport that you could play much longer. You can play a lot of games without risk of injury, and there's a lot of ways to manage it, right? With football and to a lesser extent basketball, where I think the NBA G League has been a bit of a failure for the NBA. Quiet is kept. We don't really talk about it as a failure, but how many players have really come out the G League system that have been good? Like, there's certainly some role players out there, right? But like, you're not hearing of dudes like Imani Bates who are like 5 stars, right, before, and they get to the G League, they figure it out, they become star players. Like, at best, you're talking about guys who become good role players that are like rolling out the G League, like a Sam Merrill, right? Or at worst, we're talking about G League Ignite, where you're putting 5-star prospects in there and they're coming out worse than they came in. And I think there's reasons for the failure of the G League. And I think that kind of informs why the NFL probably won't ever have a feeder system. Like, one of the big issues with developmental systems, or even trying to use college as a developmental system, is, are you trying to sell this product on television, right? Like, the problem with the UFL as a developmental product is, at the end of the day, the UFL is trying to be a television show. And in order for the UFL to be a good television show, they have to make decisions that make sense for winning games in the UFL, the coaches do, and not decisions that make sense for development. Hakeem Butler is a great example of this. Every time Hakeem Butler gets called up to an NFL team, he plays tight end. That's his position in the NFL. He is not athletic enough to play wide receiver in the NFL. But whenever you see Hakeem Butler in the UFL, he's playing wide receiver because that's where he's best in that league. So he's not really developing where he needs to develop. He's becoming a better wide receiver, but the NFL does not want to use him as a wide receiver because he's not fast enough. So where it would benefit him to be is tight end, but that's not going to make for a good television product. So he's going to play wide receiver. The same thing happens in college where, guys are doing things in college that they probably shouldn't be doing if they're focusing on their pro career. But because that's going to put the team in position to win, and because ultimately college football is a television product and it needs to be interesting in order to sell, that's what that player is going to end up doing. So when you're trying to have a developmental league but also make it a television product, it's pretty much always not going to succeed. You have to compromise too much to make it a compelling television product, to make it actually useful for development. And I think the G League is inverse of that. In order to make the G League work for development for the NBA, it can't be a compelling competitive product. And that's what the G League is. Like, you ever wonder why there's nobody at these G League games is because there's no reason to invest in a team in the G League, just because they're not trying to make decisions in the G League that are based around winning. They're making decisions that are purely based around development. And even that hasn't really worked out because they haven't invested enough money into it. And part of the reason they haven't invested enough money into the G League is because the G League is not a successful, competitive enough product to be appealing to television contractors to make some money. You see the dilemma here, right? Like, you need to make money for that developmental league to work, but the only way to do that is to compromise it as a developmental league. So that's the first hurdle that you have to get over. With the NFL, you got the specific hurdle of, hey, this game's very violent. And you can't just play game. Like, you can't just take games for granted here. I think that the NFL is never going to have a feeder system. They're never going to have a successful developmental league because the nature of football makes that really hard to do. I think what you can do is expand rosters. So have more guys be rostered, and then maybe have those guys have enough rosterable people to where you could do extra work. Maybe you could do things like have guys who are eligible to be rostered during the spring, where you could do padded practices with just those guys, right? Your developmental tagged guys, so that they can get controlled extra snaps, and maybe you could do some joint practices. So a training camp in the spring for developmental players, and then being able to roster more developmental players, I think is more along the lines, because you can't just have these guys go out there and play full football and think nothing's going to go wrong, because it's just too much of a strain on the body. So it has to be some kind of controlled thing. And it has to be separate than like what your main roster is doing. So maybe just expanding the roster and then having a tag for developmental players on that roster where you can say, hey, these guys are eligible for spring training camp. They come in for 2 months during the spring. Let's say nothing's going on really in April and in May, or maybe if you want to wait till after the draft, May and June. Have those guys come in and they do more of a full training camp to kind of get those guys ahead, where it's just like developmental guys who are eligible for it because they were just drafted, or guys who just have not had enough playing time to make sense for it. You wouldn't have like Myles Garrett at this thing. It would be kind of like an expanded rookie mini camp, but with pads. I think that's maybe where you could go, where you have periods of the NFL calendar that are dedicated to development, but not really attempting to be a product. That's, I think, the best we could do with the NFL. But like a full feeder system, I just think that it doesn't work. Football's just so expensive too that in order to have a developmental league, it has to make money. And then again, you're into that compromise of like, okay, well, we got to sacrifice the development utility of this to make it a product on on television, and then at that point, it's cooked. So maybe the answer is less about another league for these guys to get like in-game snaps, and more about finding ways to simulate snaps for more players, and maybe a special training camp for undrafted guys and guys who haven't played that much, and maybe some draft picks as well could do that for you, right? Like maybe that could be what we do as a special session for those guys. It might be worthwhile to think about, because those are the guys who don't really get that much work during actual training camp too. So that's my thing that I'm throwing out there. You feel free to take it and adjust it. You know what I mean? I'm not set in stone about this. I just kind of thought about this as you asked the question. Useless Bread says, do you think it's possible for offensive linemen to develop the ability to hit people in space, or is that something that can be taught, or is it too much based in instincts? I think it's not really based in instincts. It's about body control, right? How fast can you move while controlling what you want to do? It's athletic ability at its finest, right? Some guys are good athletes, but they move too fast. JOK was an example of this as a linebacker, right? I used to make this criticism of JOK, even though I loved him as a player. Sometimes he thinks faster than sometimes his body moves faster than his mind can think. And that puts him in compromising positions. And you see that with a lot of athletic offensive linemen where their body wants to do something, but their mind hasn't caught up to what their body wants to do. So they have to learn how to slow down a little bit, right? It's really about athletic ability and feet. That's really what determines it. If you have good feet, athletic ability, but you're not great with hitting people in space, and I mentioned this with Parker Brailsford during his breakdown, then I think that can be fixed. If you have bad feet, if you're like DeJuan Jones, I don't think that can help. You're just not big enough, athletic enough to get the job done. So I think it varies, and it's more about athletic ability, feet, body control, and all of that. If you can demonstrate good body control, then there's some upside there. If you don't have great body control, you're going to be down blocking a lot. Photo Project says, quick question, Q, outside of the draft and salary cap management, what are the criteria to evaluate a GM? In my opinion, this is just my opinion. I'm not going to make the universal rubric on judging general managers, right? But in my opinion, you evaluate the draft. You evaluate the value that a GM is getting per what the opportunity that they had with their draft picks. Not just saying, oh, we didn't get great players in this draft, but like, hey, what did we have? And what do we get relative to what we had, which I think why the drafted AV stat matters a lot, that I use for the objective Andrew Berry review, which I am trying to work on another one. I did lose my original Google Documents file for that, which is frustrating as all hell. So I have to pretty much do all the research all over again, which is going to take some time. So we're probably looking at maybe July. I'm hoping July for that. But yeah, it's the ability to get the most out of the assets that you have, right? How are you doing on money, contracts, and whatnot, managing the cap? Are you able to keep your good players, right? Or are you constantly hemorrhaging good players because you're signing big contracts that you can't really manage in the cap? And I think the most important thing is like being able to create identities, right? Create an identity on offense, create an identity on defense, and having there be an identity to your team is kind of the mark of somebody who's good at managing a team and putting together teams. Chuck says this, Q, understanding Andrew Berry seemingly killed the draft this year and had a great draft last year. How is his seat hot? These reports that if the Browns don't have success this year, even though I see reports define what success looks like, both Monken and Berry could be gone, even though most people agree that Berry's doing a great job of late. I appreciate the content. Cheers. I think the reality is that, if there's not wins and ownership expects wins, then ownership is going to make a decision, right? I don't think that I don't think that Jimmy's telling Andrew Berry that he's on the hot seat or anything like that. I just think people are assuming that that's the case because Jimmy expects to win a certain amount of games. He's been pretty obvious about that all summer. Well, not even all summer. It hasn't even been summer yet. All spring. And if those expectations aren't met, then we know what usually happens in the NFL. I think that's kind of where that comes from. Jimmy keeps saying he expects to win more games than last year. If they don't, somebody's got to go. And you only get to survive so many head coaches when you're a general manager, right? But that's where that comes from, right? I think it's more logic than sources on that one. People are just using this, basic logic there. Tracy says, what will the Browns realistically do with Watson at quarterback if the younger QBs outplay him in the preseason? Okay, let's talk about the worst case scenario for Deshaun Watson. Let's say he is unplayable and he's not usable. What then happens? Worst case scenario, Deshaun Watson is inactive on game days for 17 games. So he's on the active 53, but not on the game day 48. And he kind of just exists for a year on the roster in this kind of weird way. And then the Browns cut him with the post-June 1st designation on the first day of the new league year. So that's the worst case scenario with this whole Deshaun Watson thing, is that he just isn't active on game days and we carry a fourth quarterback and basically treat Deshaun Watson like he's not there. Obviously, the best case scenario for Deshaun is that he plays, he provides some value, and he gets signed somewhere else next year. So that's kind of the two outcomes there. And then, obviously, a bunch of stuff in between those two. Olu says this: I'm worried about Fano being another Jed Wills. I haven't been able to keep up with the draft evaluations of him, so could you tell me, are my worries justified or not? I don't think these two are remotely the same kind of player. The only thing they have in common is that Fano played right tackle a little bit in college, and Jed Wills played right tackle, and they're both flipping to left. But Fano played left tackle when he was at Utah, so as a freshman. So he has experience playing left tackle in major college football. So I would say that these two have really nothing in common. Jed's a completely different prospect than Fano was. Fano, better athlete, better mover in space, better motor, all these things. They raving about him as a person. We know that Jed's personality ended up being an issue with the Cleveland Browns. I don't think there's anything Jed Wills coded about Spencer Fano at all. Also with Fano, there's the possibility of putting him at guard or something like that if he doesn't work out at tackle, which was not a thing with Jed Wills. So completely different. I wouldn't say that comp is justified. So you could be relieved if you take my opinion seriously. Sequoia Jones says this: love the content and the perspective. Will it be difficult for the Browns to develop both Denzel Boston and Casey Concepcion? Receivers isn't like quarterback where only one guy gets to play at a time, so maybe this isn't an issue, but I hope that the resources, coaching, and reps budgeted for the early round picks doesn't take away from the other. I think it's possible to work on both of them. I think it's been done before. It's definitely going to be a task for the Browns' new wide receiver coach. But yeah, I think it's definitely doable because they all do different things, which makes it a lot easier, right? Because you're going to have to teach these things to somebody. So now it's just being taught to multiple rookies at the same time. So yeah, I think it's certainly doable. Quentin Gray says this: do you think it's playoff or bust for Watson or Sanders? Because if they have a similar year to 2025, then I can definitely see the Browns moving up for number one to get Arch Manning. And cutting their losses with Watson. They're going to cut their losses with Watson regardless, more than likely, right? Like, he has that poison pill in his contract. They're going to release him post-June 1st, and the odds of bringing back somebody that you post-June 1st designate, very low. So that's probably going to happen with Watson regardless of what happens this year. With Sanders, I mean, look, if there's not an answer on this team by the end of the season, the Browns are going to look for one. You know what I mean? And they're going to be aggressive about it. They were aggressive about it this offseason, right? But they're going to be aggressive about finding a quarterback. And if they find something they like, then, Sanders is going to be put on the back burner. So, yeah, if you want to stop the Browns from doing something, you got to play really well this year. Otherwise, if you let it get to the 2027 offseason and it's still a question, the Browns are liable to draft somebody. The Browns are liable to trade for somebody. They're liable to sign somebody, to play quarterback. They're not going to mess around with the position, right? And I think they're going to be more willing to spend money on the position over the next couple of years as they get rid of the stain of the Watson contract. So, yeah, I think that's kind of where it is. This year is going to be huge for whoever is in this quarterback room that wants to maintain outside of this year. But that's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. You have a great day. Have an even better night.